Very good evening and welcome to the Bottom Line. My name is Nzinga Kunda. We begin as usual with our number of the day. Today that number is 396 billion rand. That, according to Finance Minister Tito Mboweni, is how much will be set aside for spending on learning and culture. There will be investment in new schools and providing those schools with adequate water, electricity and sanitation. There is also going to be a science and technology grant to help grade R to grade 3 learners with robotics. South Africa's economic growth for 2020 is projected to be at 0.9% in 2020. That's of course in line with what the IMF and the World Bank have been saying, and lower than Treasury's 1.2% projections for the same year. So I'm joined in studio by Mandla Issacs from Zehuti Advisory, going to have some discussions about what exactly happened in that budget today. First things first, was that budget the one that's going to stave off a downgrade as well as satisfy the many different constituents who have interest in what happens with our budget?
It might. It's entirely possible that Moody's might hold until later in the year to make a decision on a downgrade. I think overall it was a smart, balanced, even brave budget. Treasury really did confront some of the underlying issues that have bedeviled us for several years, and unfortunately that government has left for a decade to pile up, and they had to confront it today.
There was a fear around taxes. People were saying we're going to get a VAT increase or tax increases. What we actually saw was Finance Minister Tito Mboweni saying people who earn around 265,000 Rand will have a reduction in the amount of tax they have to pay.
Well, you know, having been part of the Treasury team a couple of years ago and being part of the team that raised VAT, which was a very difficult decision, it's the first time in 25 years that happened. I was not expecting major tax increases because, quite frankly, we're at the limit of what the public will bear from a legitimacy perspective and what the economy will bear. I mean, quite frankly, you know, there's no scope. Our corporate income tax is already very high. The personal income tax burden is already quite high and has increased over the last several years. There really wasn't a lot of scope to raise taxes and expect people to comply, and also to not hurt the economy in terms of growth.
Let's talk about spending. It's set to be reduced by 261 billion Rand. How is that going to happen?
So, you know, what they've said is that they've made some spending reductions to that effect, and then they've had some spending increases, which are largely around the SOE, the money that's going to Eskom and SAA, which nets out at just under 160 billion Rand, which was the big promise that Treasury made at MTBPS. If you remember, you know, the debt to GDP ratio was heading towards the 80% territory, which set off alarm bells. And so at the time, Treasury had not built the political support on what those reductions would be, as well as the technical exercise of finding the savings. And so what they've done is delivered on what they promised, with a massive caveat, right? That caveat being that they're going to be able to moderate public sector wages, which is going to be a huge political challenge.
Now, Howard said they'll go to war over that cutting or possibly interfering with public wages.
Well, look, this is one of the core political issues that's affected our economic situation. Our economy has not grown in real terms for a decade. It's basically been flat. And yet public sector wages have grown by 40% in real terms over the last 12 years. And government has not confronted this issue, in large part because the unions under the umbrella of COSATU are part of the governing tripartite alliance. And so to keep the labor unions inside the tent, supporting the ANC, campaigning for the ANC in elections, the government has been wary to push back on wages. But unfortunately right now we've run out of road. We simply can't do this anymore. And so the government has had to push back, and now we're going to see. I think the renegotiating that third year is going to be ambitious, but certainly the next wage negotiations are going to be much tougher.
What's also tough is managing our debt as a country. How are we spending when you compare to other sectors, perhaps such as policing?
So, I mean, this is really an important number to put in perspective, right? We're spending something like 220 billion Rand per year on interest costs, which is more than peace and security, so more than our entire police service and what we pay to our armed forces, spend on our armed forces. It's more than what we spend on community development, which includes transfers to our metros, cities, municipalities, as well as housing, things of that nature, public transport. So these are big numbers. I mean, the interest number is almost as high as the health number. which is insane. So it's completely unsustainable, and that's why you're seeing in the finance family and a growing acknowledgement within cabinet and with the president that that kind of spending growth is unsustainable unless we get the economy growing. And there's new momentum around implementing those reforms because growth is the only answer.
When Finance Minister Tito Mboweni was discussing our growth projections for 2020, he says our economy is going to grow at about 0.9%. He also mentioned different countries and says because of the coronavirus, we also can't have an accurate reading of what's going to happen. Whenever something happens on the global markets, they sneeze, we catch a cold. Is it something to be concerned about, and could we see that number dropping perhaps later?
Well, there's certainly some uncertainty around what's going to happen with China. How will China be affected by the coronavirus? How might other countries around the big geographies around the world that we are integrated with from a trade and export perspective, how will they be affected? So it's hard to say at the moment. Treasury has come in at 0.9%, which, you know, for the last several years, Treasury's numbers have been inaccurate. The growth has always come in below their projections. They've come in at a pretty reasonable projection, not far off the IMF, the World Bank, and Moody's. You know, I think that we're going to have to wait and see on the impact of the coronavirus. But at the same time, you know, global growth is expected to be strong. Global inflation is contained. You know, we do export a lot of value-added goods, and we're certainly focused on beneficiation, adding value, tourism, all of those, you know, labor-absorbing, value-adding industries which are really going to help us grow our economy. And, you know, the United States and the EU are expected to grow steadily, and so we're just going to have to hope that this coronavirus outbreak is contained and does not create a huge economic disruption.
So very briefly, there was a lot of fanfare over both the State Bank and the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Was what the Minister said today sufficient to talk about how that's going to happen? Because that was the question.
Well, I think the Sovereign Wealth Fund is clearly at very early stages. The State Bank, you know, has been kind of on the ANC wish list for several years. It was hoped that the Post Bank would become that. It wasn't clear from the announcement today, is the Post Bank going to be the center of that? We certainly have a number of development finance institutions at national level as well as at provincial level. And so he did allude towards consolidating those. So we're going to have to wait and see, but it's going to be something important to watch because the question becomes, as much as we hear anecdotal evidence, people saying, well, they can't access funding in the economy, we have the IDCs, we have the NEFs. You know, what are the projects that people are saying they can't get funding from traditional banks and venture capital funds that they're going to want to go to the State Bank for? We're going to need to watch that because in countries like India, we've seen where state banks become abused, where politically connected people get loans that end up being bad loans, where they don't feel the need to repay because, again, as we've seen with ESCOM, the problem with SOEs is that there's always idea in the back of everyone's mind that, well, if it goes wrong, the state will pay, which means you and I will pay. And that's a problem. So we need to watch that very closely.
Thank you so much for your time and insight. Mandla Issacs from Zehuti Advisory joining me in studio there.